The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Welcome to International Insights. I am Doug Davis, and with me is Michael Slobodchikoff. On this episode, we'll be speaking with Professor Foster Hirsch, a professor in the film department at Brooklyn College. He is the author of numerous books on both film and theater. His most recent book is Hollywood and Movies in the 50s, The Collapse of the Studio System, The Thrill of Cinerama, and the Invasion of the Ultimate Body Snatcher, Television. It's a great title, and this book was just reviewed in the most recent New York Review of Books, so congratulations, Professor Hirsch, and welcome to the program from New York.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Professor Hirsch, how did you come to appreciate film, and what do you find as cinema's contribution to American culture?
Well, I'm a moviegoer from a very, very early age. I grew up in Los Angeles, and I had the good fortune to see movies in famous movie palaces, and I also had the good fortune to have parents who loved the movies. So I grew up as a kind of movie kid, and it was interesting that my parents liked different genres. My mother hated comedies and wanted only, as she called them, heavy dramas. And my father loved westerns and war films. My mother didn't like those. So separately, I got taken to westerns and war films on the one hand and melodramas on the other, but neither of them like comedy. So my education is deficient in the area of comedy. And I tell students, because I rarely teach any comic films, actually, I said, as you could tell, I have no sense of humor, so don't expect comedy from me. In fact, I think movies have been an extraordinary contribution to American culture. They're the way we have been perceived, both here and abroad. I think movies make a remarkable cultural contribution, and you can trace the changes in the culture from the movies that get a lot of attention. Not to jump to this right away, but this year's Academy Award winner, Honora, is a film I can't bear, and I think it tells us a lot about the culture. In the 50s, such a film could never have been made or appreciated or acknowledged as a work of art, which I certainly think it is not. I think it tells us a lot about where we are now as a culture and a decline of culture and cultural values.
Yeah.
And I don't know how that film will be perceived. Will it pass the test of time? I very much doubt it. But you don't know that until time has passed. That's why I feel secure in my book on the 50s in making judgments, because enough time has passed to tell which films from that decade or other decades near it have passed that very challenging and steep test of time. We can't tell now. We have to wait to see how today's films are going to look 50, 60 years from now.
Excellent, excellent. Foster, your most recent book looks at Hollywood in the 1950s. You state that there were more great films produced in the 1950s than any other 10-year period in Hollywood history. The 50s were complex and unusual, and it was a time when the U.S. was a world power. What made the 1950s a unique time for Hollywood?
I think part of the high quality of the output was the fact that the studios were in trouble. Such a thing called television had a huge inroad on movie attendance. In the 40s, if you look at the numbers of how many people went to the movies on a weekly basis, those numbers will seem unbelievable to you. And just look at the theaters where movies played back then, movie palaces. The 1,000 seats up to 5,000 seats, and often were sold out. Those numbers are not attainable in today's marketplace, and that's why our theaters got smaller and smaller, the multiplexes. So that very secure industry was under threat in the 50s. And to survive, to bring back audiences who had gone to television and weren't coming to the movies in the same regularity, they had to reinvent the system. So they had 3D, Cinerama, CinemaScope, VistaVision, widescreen processes, and those technological differences also brought in people who were curious. You couldn't see 3D at home. You couldn't see a huge widescreen at home. But it wasn't just the technology. The producers also felt they had to find new subject matter to attract people away from the television sets. They had a real rival. And so there were films on subjects that were new at the time. So I find that to survive, the studios had an extraordinarily creative output for that 10-year period. Part of my project in my book was to challenge the stereotyped view of the 50s as a dull, conformity-ridden, consumerist, bland, humorless decade. Not true. And I think, Doug, you already mentioned, it's a very complicated time. It was a time of the blacklist and the HUAC investigations, a very politically divisive period, almost like the one we're in now. And that created an opening for all kinds of storytelling, often allegorically and metaphorically. Lots of films are about communists in the 50s, but they're not directly about communists. They're about communists symbolically. That makes looking at the films a kind of excavation project. What's in the subtext? Which I found, as a viewer, revisiting these films so many years later, fascinating. Because The Robe, which was the first CinemaScope film, was actually written by a communist, and Christians and communists are equated in the film. And I make a case for it in my book that may surprise a lot of people. So this seemingly conformist movie that was the first to sell CinemaScope is also a coded text about the fervor of anti-communism in the 50s. So all these levels that I discovered in the 50s, because you couldn't always be direct in the same way that you can now. And sometimes, can I say this? Sometimes lack of artistic license can lead to creative inspiration, if that makes any sense.
That certainly makes a lot of sense, and I'd love to return to that a little later. I'd like to talk about one particular film now, On the Waterfront. Do you consider it to be one of the greatest films of the 1950s? And what makes the movie stand out?
I would say it's the greatest film of the 1950s. If I had to choose one film from a period that has many fine movies, I would say that's the greatest. And I've been showing it to people and making that outstanding claim for a long time now. And it always holds up. The film has never failed me as a presenter. It's always powerful. Students like it, film festival goers like it, and talk about timeliness. It was directed by Elia Kazan, and written by Bud Schulberg, both of whom were friendly witnesses during the HUAC investigation of alleged communism in Hollywood. They never got over that in their personal lives. They were never forgiven by many people for naming names of other people who had attended communist meetings with them. They both felt justified in what they did. But On the Waterfront is a film about the importance of testifying. Terry Malloy, the Brando character, testifies before a committee about the corruption on the waterfront. Testifying, he achieves a kind of heroism and a kind of freedom. You read that back into the creator's circumstance of testifying before HUAC, and you can see that the film offers some kind of justification. Can you appreciate On the Waterfront without knowing the political context? Of course you can, and I think largely at the time it was not taken as a film with contemporary political reference. But it's there now for all to see. Kazan and Schulberg talk about it. I knew Bud Schulberg at the end of his life, and he told me that even years after his testimony, years after his testimony, people would cross the street to avoid talking to him. He was never forgiven. What's also significant about the film? I like to say I'm not one given to understatement. I make big claims. I think it's the best acted film I've ever seen. It's a showcase for method acting, which was instituted in 1947 with the founding of the Actors Studio on West 44th Street in New York. It's still there. And it had an enormous influence under the direction of Lee Strasberg in creating a new kind of acting for the screen. Every actor on the Waterfront was trained at the Actors Studio. So they're working in a common style. And it's a style, it's an inner style, a style in which the actors explore the subtext. It's a personal style. It creates a sense of realism. Marlon Brando's performance, I would say the best male performance I've ever seen in a movie, and Kazan makes the same statement. Just for acting, it's an extraordinary achievement. For the score by Leonard Bernstein, the cinematography, black and white, American neorealism by Boris Kaufman, any number of reasons. It's an extraordinary landmark film.
Excellent. Foster, you were able to come to Montgomery for John Martello's class at the Capri Theater, and you also recently participated in 2 film discussions, and I'd like to talk with you about the film East of Eden. This is another Kazan film, and it featured James Dean. I want to ask, what made this film special, and how is James Dean unique? And why was James Dean's selection for this part kind of unique in cinema history?
Well, James Dean in the 50s touched a nerve. He and his persona gives the lie to a lot of the cliches and stereotypes about the 50s as being bland and conformist. James Dean was a nonconformist, an individual. He was troubled in his personal life, and he brought that inner anxiety to the screen. He made only 3 films: East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant. Performances are timeless. At the time, they were as revolutionary as Brando in terms of the method. He mumbled, yes, he did. He paused in delivery of the lines. His delivery had a naturalistic flavor that you hadn't really seen in movies before, except for the work of Brando and Montgomery Clift. And he incarnated a sense of youthful anxiety, uncertainty, rebellion, which touched a contemporary nerve and continues to appeal to young people. I show a James Dean film in my classes frequently because I really do want to gauge how the students are responding to James Dean. And I always say to myself, if the students begin to say he seems dated or out of touch, or they can't relate to him, it's probably time for me to consider retiring. I haven't had to make that determination yet because the students never tell me they can't relate to him. They always find something contemporary and relatable in his persona. Because he died young, he remains the perpetual teenager, like he's the first American teenager and the perpetual one. In his films, he's searching for the father, he's searching for security, he's an outsider, he's troubled, he's anxious, and he's wonderfully appealing. Everybody wants to be with James Dean. Gay audiences hope he's gay. Women want to be his girlfriend. Mothers want him for a son. There's something so intimate and available about his persona. And the camera loves him, and he knew how to play to the camera. He was a skillful actor. It seems as if he's just being real. No, he uses a style to evoke the sense of reality. East of Eden is about the son's search for love from his father. Both Kazan and Dean, who didn't get along, but they shared one trait which bound them together. They had disapproving fathers who never accepted them or acknowledged their gifts. Kazan's father wanted him to be a pharmacist and to stop this nonsense with directing. He never got acceptance from his father. Dean had a very cold and remote relationship with his father. And that pain is brought into East of Eden. It's palpable. And that's why the film continues to evoke such strong reactions in audiences. Doug, didn't it have a strong reaction the other week at Capri?
Seeing it on the big screen was an amazing experience. I'd seen it on the TV before, but never on large screen, and it evoked something that I had rarely experienced in film. So yes.
Fantastic. I would like to circle back to what you mentioned earlier when you talked about Kazan's friendly testimony to the House of Un-American Activities Committee and McCarthy. Could you explain a little bit about that time period and how that affected Hollywood in general, especially Kazan?
Kazan had been a communist in the 30s when he was in the group theater. Bud Schulberg had been a communist in the 30s. Being a communist in the 30s wasn't quite the same as being a communist in the post-war period. Both Kazan and Schulberg became very disenchanted with the Communist Party. They said it was tyrannical. It tried to tell them how to think. They felt indoctrinated. They felt as artists, they were strangled by doctrines of the party. And they felt they had no creative leverage. They thought communism was a heinous political philosophy. It didn't work. They left the party, and they thought it also presented a danger to America. They wanted to testify about their disillusionment with communism. They did not want to testify about who had attended meetings with them. That is, they were happy to talk about them. They were eager to talk about their own political histories. They didn't want to talk about anybody else's. And the first time Kazan appeared before the committee, he did not name names. But then he was placed in an impossible position. If he didn't name names, he would have been blacklisted. And like other directors and writers, he might have had to relocate to Europe to continue his career. It was a terrible time because people who were communists or had been or hadn't disavowed their communism were no longer employable in Hollywood. And he struggled with it. And then he decided he would name names in the interests of the danger that he felt communism represented at the time. The horror of the committee investigation, and I discovered this in my research for the book, is that the committee already knew all the names. They knew everybody. Kazan and Schulberg were giving them no information. Asking them to name names was simply a way of humiliating them, and it worked. I think the villain here is the committee, who asked questions that they had no right to ask. They had the answers to who was in the party, who had attended those meetings, and forcing these men to name names, even if they ultimately convinced themselves that they were doing so willingly, was a method of simply debasing a ritual of degradation for these men, and their reputations never completely recovered. Even as we speak, their reputations are tarnished by their act of being friendly witnesses, informers, pigeons.
Wow, that's a very challenging story. I want to turn to a dark side of Hollywood. You wrote an interesting book on film noir called The Dark Side of the Screen, Film Noir. And this style traces its roots into German Expressionism and was a Hollywood feature in films in the 1940s and 50s. What is film noir? And the 1950s are considered a golden age by some, although there was a lot of tension nonetheless within the United States. How does film noir fit into this cultural world?
Well, film noir is a style of filmmaking that was uh, hard to say. Was it born in the 50s? It was in the 40s. It was named by a group of French critics, Parisian critics that always looked at American studio films very closely. During the occupation in World War II, no American films had been released in Paris. When they were released in a group in 1945, at the end of the war, the French critics saw in a number of the films what they identified as a darker, more negative strain in American movies, crime movies, and that these films lacked the affirmation and the upbeat qualities they had traditionally identified as, quotes, American. They said these films are different, they're dark. Being French, they weren't going to give these films an American name, they gave them a French name, film noir, dark film or black film. And that style of film became very influential in the 40s and the 50s. And the classic noir period is about from 1941 to the end of the 50s. And the dark tone did take over in Hollywood in the supposedly sunny and optimistic 50s. Along with the upbeat films, there were a lot of very downbeat films that were either full-fledged film noir or had noir elements. Dark lighting, images of enclosure and entrapment, a vision of the American male as somehow disabled or demasculinized, the rise of the powerful woman represented by the femme fatale, the fatal, treacherous woman. So these films reflected social realignments and readjustments as a result of the war, men off to the front, women stepping up for jobs in the marketplace. And you can see a real social and moral and sexual realignment in these crime films. Film noir, it's a style of filmmaking, but to qualify as film noir, there has to be an element of crime. Think of film noir as a modernization of the 30s gangster film. They're not about born criminals, but about people who become criminals or are thrown into a criminal matrix through lust, mischance, mistiming, greed. They're great movies, and they're probably the most popular genre from the golden age of Hollywood of all. I'm a member of the Film Noir Foundation Board of Directors. We do festivals throughout the country. I'm going to Boston and DC this year to host film noir festivals. There's a loyal audience for these films. They're continuingly popular and highly thought of, and they're really good, many of them. It's a very rich tradition in American filmmaking, and they're American. And they had an influence on European crime films. So very influential and powerful group of films, the film noir. Your audience should have to just probably mention a few titles that I'm raving about here. Double Indemnity, Sunset Boulevard, Laura, Out of the Past, Odds Against Tomorrow, Touch of Evil, Sudden Fear. I could go on and on. There are a lot of them, but those are highlights.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. And one of the themes that we've been talking about throughout this program has been the impact of culture on Hollywood and vice versa. How do you see cinema's place within American culture changing, and what are the consequences of this change?
Well, I think cinema has to continually update itself. I'm always worried that my students will accuse me of being stuck in the past. You have to change. As a teacher, I have to change. The filmmaking culture has to change to be responsive to the culture. So, for instance, now we're much more sensitive about race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality than in the 50s. You can look at some 50s films, and even if they're very good, ideologically, there may be some problems. And so those problems have to be adjusted for a contemporary audience. We're more sensitive to things now. We're aware of things that people at the time did not pay attention to. For instance, in the old days, you could cast an ethnic role, and you usually did, with a white actor who put on makeup. That's not acceptable now. In the 40s and 50s, it was considered standard and it wasn't thought about. It wasn't meant to be an insult. It was just how things were done. So as social and gendered conventions change, they have to be reflected in the movies. And sometimes movies can lead the culture. Often I think movies follow and reflect the culture. But change is essential and unavoidable. We think differently now than we did then. And I ran into that issue in my book, and I realized I was looking at the films from a dual perspective, from how the films were perceived at the time. I was there, I remember, and how they're looked at now. And some of the films have dated, some haven't, and some of the films we may still like a lot, but we have to adjust to their different moral and social schemes. They're not up to the minute. A 60, 70, 80-year-old film is not going to capture all the nuances of contemporary ideology.
That's true. So your book on Hollywood in the 50s is very impressive. My last question to you is, how do you plan to build on that, and what is your next project?
But the next project, and I announce it at the end of the book, is Hollywood in the movies of the 60s, Wild in the Streets. These two decades are very closely connected. The 60s wouldn't have happened without the 50s. And people who like to bash the 50s, and there are a lot of them out there, and I'm trying to defend against them, celebrate the 60s. The 60s were not as up to date and contemporary as 60s celebrants like to think. It too was a very divided, complex period. Battles between old and new. The 60s weren't all of a sudden magically liberated about everything. Not at all. And I'm going to try to show how the 50s and 60s are much more closely interrelated than they're given credit for. And again, I'm going to use the fact that I was there as an eyewitness. I went to these movies, Bonnie and Clyde and Midnight Cowboy and Dr. Strangelove and The Graduate, when they opened, and I know what kinds of responses they elicited. But I'm also going to be talking about a whole range of films that people might not know. So I'm hoping that the 60s book will expand people's consciousness about the film culture of the 60s, but also the political culture.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Foster, this has been a great pleasure. And again, it's wonderful to welcome you back to the South virtually. So thank you for taking the time, and I hope we get to do this again. So
thank you so much. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.